Rome, August 1503. A suffocating summer heat hangs over the Vatican. In a darkened chamber, Pope Alexander VI lies convulsing on his bed, skin burning with fever. Nearby, his son, the infamous warlord Cesare Borgia, is also fighting for each breath. Father and son, two of the most powerful men in Renaissance Europe, have been struck down simultaneously by a mysterious illness. Outside their door, panicked whispers ripple through the halls of the apostolic palace. Could this be divine judgment for their sins? Had the master poisoners fallen victim to their own poison? Or was it simply Rome's annual plague of malaria claiming even the mighty? No one knows for sure. As midnight passes, candles guttering, the Borgias hover between life and death. The truth of their affliction will die with them, but their legend will only grow. A legend of power, corruption, and murder that will haunt the Vatican for centuries. The Borgias' final agony has begun, and a dynasty built on deceit is about to face its day of reckoning. Welcome to the story of the House of Borgia, a family whose name became synonymous with greed, intrigue, and the darkest secrets of the Catholic Church. For 11 years, Pope Alexander VI and his children ruled Renaissance Rome like a personal kingdom. Their reign was a spectacle of scandal and audacity. Poison in jeweled chalices, rumored orgies behind Vatican walls, bribery in broad daylight, all under the guise of God's representative on earth. This is the tale of how a modest noble family from Spain clawed its way to the throne of St. Peter, accumulating enemies and influence in equal measure. It's a saga drenched in blood and betrayal, and filled with conspiracies that historians still puzzle over 500 years later. But as sensational as it sounds, it's all part of the very real history of the Catholic Church. Before we plunge deeper into this morass of papal intrigue, take a moment to hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Trust me, what we're about to uncover about Vatican power plays and Renaissance realpolitik will change how you think about religion and politics. You won't want to miss a second of it. And here's why. The Borgias didn't just dominate their own era. Their methods and scandals echo through the ages. In fact, as you learn their story, you may start seeing their fingerprints in the corridors of power today. This isn't just dusty history. It's a masterclass in how power really works, one that still resonates in modern politics. So strap in and prepare to journey back to an age of princes and poisons. We're going to an era when popes raised armies, when cardinals openly kept mistresses, and when a Spanish family named Borgia reinvented themselves as the Borgias, determined to conquer Italy from within the heart of the church. This is their story, a cinematic rise and fall, and it begins not in the marble halls of Rome, but in a small Spanish town that most people have never heard of. The year is 1378, and in the sun-baked kingdom of Valencia on Spain's eastern coast, a baby boy is born in the town of Zataiva. His name is Alonso de Borgia, known to history by the Italianized name Alfonso Borgia. By all accounts, the Borgia family are minor aristocrats, respectable, yes, but nothing that predicts greatness. No one looking at infant Alonso in that provincial town could imagine that he would one day sit on the papal throne. But the Borgias possessed something more valuable than noble blood: ruthless ambition and strategic brilliance. In medieval Europe, upward mobility was rare, but not impossible. To rise, one needed education, influential patrons, and a keen sense of opportunity. Young Alonso would embrace all three. From an early age, Alonso showed a sharp mind. He pursued an education when many nobles of the time disdained scholarly pursuits. In the 1390s, he enrolled at the University of Lleida to study law, both civil and canon law. Picture the young Spaniard poring over dense legal texts and church decrees by candlelight. This wasn't mere academia. This was reconnaissance. Alonso was mapping out the legal and political machinery of church and state, the very system he intended to conquer. By mastering law and doctrine, he armed himself with knowledge of how power operated both in kingdoms and in the Vatican. In an era when might often trumped right, Alonso Borgia understood that knowledge could be a weapon. Armed with his law doctorate and a talent for diplomacy, Alonso entered the service of the Kingdom of Aragon. The late 14th and early 15th century church was in chaos due to the Western Schism, a time when rival popes in Rome and Avignon each claimed to be the true pontiff. This split threatened to tear Christendom apart, and resolving it required a special breed of mediator. Alonso proved to be exactly that. He leveraged his legal expertise and political savvy to help heal the rift. In 1429, he played a key role in persuading the last Avignon claimant, Antipope Clement VIII, to step aside and recognize Pope Martin V in Rome. It was a diplomatic masterstroke. The successful end of the schism was enormously appreciated by Rome. Gratitude in high places can catapult a man's career, and it did for Alonso Borgia. That same year, 1429, the Pope rewarded Alonso's loyalty by appointing him Bishop of Valencia, a prestigious post in his home region. Within a decade and a half, he was elevated further. In 1444, Pope Eugene IV named Alonso a cardinal. The one-time law student from backwater Zataiva was now part of the inner circle of church governance. This meteoric rise was no accident. It was strategy. Alonso had positioned himself as the indispensable ally, the problem solver, the man who delivered results when it mattered. By the time he was in his 70s, Cardinal Alonso de Borgia had built a formidable network of contacts across Europe. Kings, princes, and fellow churchmen knew and respected him. Importantly, he had also begun quietly advancing his family's fortunes. He brought relatives to Rome, secured positions for them, and groomed a younger generation to follow in his footsteps. One of those young relatives was his sister's son, Rodrigo Lanzal, whom Alonso formally adopted and brought into his household. Rodrigo, just a teenager, would watch and learn from his seasoned uncle, absorbing lessons that he'd use to infamous effect later. Then, in 1455, an extraordinary turn of events put the Borgia family on the map in a way no one expected. Pope Nicholas V died, and the College of Cardinals gathered in conclave to elect a successor. The leading candidates fought bitterly, factions splintered, and weeks passed without a clear winner. Alonso Borgia, at age 77, was respected but considered too old and politically neutral, a compromise candidate in a deadlocked situation. And that is exactly why he was chosen. Perhaps the feuding cardinals thought the elderly Spaniard would be a harmless, short-term pope who wouldn't rock the boat. On April 8, 1455, Alfonso de Borgia was elected Pope Calixtus III, the first Spanish pope in history. The Borgias' dramatic ascent had begun. Yet those cardinals who expected a feeble caretaker pope were in for a rude awakening. Calixtus III may have been old, but he had decades of pent-up ambition to unleash and a family to establish. In the 3 short years of his papacy, 1455 to 1458, Calixtus III would lay the foundation for a dynasty, turning the papacy itself into an instrument of family power. The world was about to learn that there's nothing more dangerous than underestimating a Borgia. Stay tuned. The audacious moves Calixtus III made from the chair of St. Peter shocked his contemporaries. What he did next would set a precedent for nepotism and intrigue that the Vatican had never seen. And it starts with a move so bold it left the Roman elite sputtering in outrage. When Pope Calixtus III took charge in 1455, he was not content to simply wear the tiara and tend the flock. He had a mission: to secure his family's power for generations to come. His motto might as well have been "Charity begins at home," because Calixtus immediately elevated his relatives to key positions. This time-honored practice of papal nepotism, from nepos, Latin for nephew, was nothing new. Many popes favored family, but Calixtus raised it to an art form. Just months into his reign, he convened a consistory to appoint new cardinals. Among the names announced was his own beloved nephew Rodrigo Borgia, whom he made a cardinal at the astonishing age of 25. It was virtually unheard of for someone so young to join the College of Cardinals. The Roman religious establishment was stunned. Making Rodrigo a prince of the church at 25 signaled that Calixtus wasn't just securing his family a slice of the pie. He was giving them the whole bakery. Nor did Calixtus stop with Rodrigo. In total, He named two of his nephews as cardinals in 1456 and packed the Vatican administration with Borgia relatives and loyalists. Positions that controlled the papal state's finances, the distribution of benefices, the administration of justice. All were soon held by men who owed their allegiance to the House of Borgia. The Pope's enemies muttered that Rome was being Hispanicized, flooded with Spaniards from the Valencia region. But Calixtus was unmoved by complaints. He had spent a lifetime in church politics and understood a fundamental truth. Power must be consolidated to be effective. And consolidate he did, straight into Borgia hands. Consider the financial sphere. Calixtus III took hold of the Vatican's treasury and treated it like a family bank. War with the Ottoman Turks was raging. Constantinople had fallen in 1453. So Pope Calixtus preached a crusade and began raising funds for war. But rumor had it that papal funds were also enriching the Borgia clan. The Pope directed lucrative church revenues to his kin, and large sums were funneled into purchasing lands and titles for the family. Calixtus acquired estates around Rome and in the countryside, planting Borgia roots in Italian soil. He also became a patron of arts and architecture, commissioning works that prominently featured the Borgia coat of arms, a red bull on a gold field. It was image-building in every sense, culturally legitimizing his upstart family among the Italian nobility. Money flowed freely from the papal coffers under Calixtus, prompting one observer to wryly note that the Borgia Pope makes the gold of the church gleam in Spanish chests. All the while, the Roman aristocratic families, the Orsini, Colonna, and their ilk, looked on in alarm. Who were these Spanish outsiders seizing posts and purse strings in the Holy See? But those grandees had misjudged Calixtus III badly. Under his grandfatherly demeanor lurked a master of power politics. He had not forgotten the lessons of a lifetime. In Renaissance power struggles, boldness often wins where caution falters. Calixtus calculated that by the time his opponents organized against him, he would have already secured his family's position. And he was right. During his pontificate, no one dared move openly against the Pope's relatives. The old Pope may have been nepotistic, but he also exuded a confidence that gave potential enemies pause. It was as if Calixtus was daring the cardinals, "Go ahead, try to oppose me, and see what happens." In Renaissance politics, that kind of audacity could be more deterrent than any army. Yet even popes are mortal. In August 1458, after just 3 years on the throne, Calixtus III died at age 80. His reign had been short but transformative. In that brief span, he had planted the Borgia banner firmly in Italy and elevated young Rodrigo to a station from which far greater prizes could be grasped. As Rome braced for the next papal conclave, many breathed a sigh of relief. Surely, with the elderly Spaniard gone, the Borgia influence would wane. The cardinals would elect an Italian, perhaps, who would undo some of Calixtus's excesses. The upstart family from Valencia would be politely shown the door, and things could return to normal. They could not have been more wrong. Unknown to them, they had just witnessed only the opening act of the most scandalous dynasty in Vatican history. The Borgias were not retreating to obscurity, they were only getting started. And the next act would center on Rodrigo Borgia, the charismatic nephew Calixtus had thrust into the limelight, who had plans of his own to make the eternal city bow to the name Borgia. If you thought nepotism under Calixtus III was shocking, wait until you see how Rodrigo Borgia navigates the shark-infested waters after his uncle's death. Deprived of his patron, young Rodrigo must survive on wits and charm alone in a hostile Rome, and his tactics will redefine corruption and influence in ways that still echo today. 1458, Rome. Pope Calixtus III is dead, and the Spanish safety net beneath 27-year-old Rodrigo Borgia has vanished. The new pope, Pius II, is an Italian humanist who openly criticizes the moral laxity of clergy. He holds no love for the Spanish pups his predecessor promoted. Many of Calixtus's appointees are swiftly shown the door. But Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia? He's too clever to be cast aside. In this perilous moment, the Borgia scion faces a choice: fade back into obscurity or prove himself indispensable to those in power. Rodrigo chooses the latter and does so with style. How does a young foreign cardinal survive, even thrive, under a hostile pope? Rodrigo's strategy was twofold: extreme competence and irresistible charm. First, he leaned into the administrative role his uncle had given him. Under Calixtus, Rodrigo had been appointed vice-chancellor of the Holy See, essentially the papacy's chief administrator. Far from being a sinecure, this job oversaw the papal chancery, the engine that kept church documents, finance, and appointments running. Rodrigo threw himself into the work. He proved efficient, shrewd with money, and politically astute, quickly earning a reputation as the Vatican's go-to problem solver. Pope Pius II, who disliked Rodrigo's lifestyle, grudgingly admitted the young man was exceptionally good at his job. And so, even as other Borgia loyalists were stripped of offices, Rodrigo kept his position. Over the next several years, and through multiple papacies, he would remain vice-chancellor, accumulating enormous wealth in the process. Indeed, contemporaries marveled and grumbled at how rich this upstart cardinal became. But Rodrigo understood that gold greases wheels, and he used his fortune to buy friends and favors liberally across Europe. Then there was Rodrigo's social side, the legendary charm. Tall, handsome, and affable, Cardinal Borgia had a knack for winning people over at lavish dinners and parties. He spoke multiple languages, flattered both princes and servants with equal finesse, and remembered personal details about everyone. It was said he could smile and joke his way out of any scandal. And scandals there were. Rodrigo did not even pretend to live a celibate clerical life. He openly kept a long-term mistress, the striking Venanza de Catania, who bore him 4 children: Juan, Cesare, Lucrezia, and Geoffrey. Far from hiding these children, Rodrigo doted on them. Rome's gossip mill nearly exploded at the thought of a cardinal throwing weddings for his acknowledged illegitimate children and parading them around in public. Pope Pius II was aghast at Rodrigo's brazen conduct and rebuked him sharply for indulgence with mistresses. Such behavior would have ruined most clergymen's careers. But Rodrigo had cultivated an image of untouchability, and more importantly, utility. Even the disapproving Pius II needed the talented vice-chancellor to manage the papal bureaucracy. As one Rai commentator noted, people will forgive almost anything in someone who makes their lives easier. That was Rodrigo's secret weapon. He made himself indispensable. Rival factions in the church found that this charismatic Spaniard could broker a compromise when all others failed. Italian nobles who scorned his morals still came to enjoy his extravagant feasts, and sometimes left them with secret deals arranged. Over the next few decades, through the reigns of 4 popes, from Pius II through Innocent VIII, Cardinal Borgia survived every twist of fortune. He played the long game, accumulating influence, blackmail information, and alliances across the continent. He befriended everyone from King Ferdinand of Aragon to the Sforza rulers of Milan. If 2 powerful figures were at odds, Rodrigo deftly positioned himself as the friendly mediator who could smooth things out. By the 1480s, Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia was arguably the most powerful man in Rome who wasn't pope. He owned palaces filled with art, vineyards in the countryside, and a network of client cardinals who dined at his table. Some called him a puppet master, others a simple bon vivant. But even his enemies had to concede. Rodrigo got things done. Need a loan for a war? Rodrigo could arrange it from a Florentine banker he knew. Need to quell a quarrel between 2 dukes? Rodrigo's silver tongue would negotiate a marriage between their children. In public, he was all smiles and geniality, a genial host with a naughty streak. In private, he kept meticulous track of favors owed and owed, building a ledger of loyalty that spanned Europe. This phase of Rodrigo's life illustrates a crucial insight about power. Influence often precedes authority. By the time Pope Innocent VIII lay on his deathbed in 1492, Rodrigo had amassed the influence. All that remained was to grab the authority, the papal throne itself. But getting elected pope is a far different challenge than surviving as a cardinal. It would require every trick in Rodrigo's considerable book and a willingness to break rules on a scale that would make even Renaissance insiders blush. How does a man widely known for his mistresses and money actually become the vicar of Christ? In the summer of 1492, Rodrigo Borgia set out to do the unthinkable by the papacy. Think modern elections are corrupt? What happened behind the closed doors of the Sistine Chapel that year is jaw-dropping, and we're about to pull back the curtain on it. Rome, August 1492. The air inside the conclave is thick and stale. 24 cardinals are locked away in the Vatican, voting in secrecy to choose the next pope. Among them sits Rodrigo Borgia, now 61 years old, radiating confidence. He has spent over 30 years positioning himself for this moment. What he's about to attempt will become one of the most infamous papal elections in history. The College of Cardinals in 1492 is bitterly divided. Italian cardinals want one of their own. French and Spanish factions push their candidates. Weeks drag on with no clear majority. Enter Rodrigo, everyone's second choice, a man with plenty of blemishes but also proven administrative skill. Officially, he maintains an air of pious neutrality. Unofficially, his agents are moving through the conclave like merchants through a bazaar. Bribery, of course, was strictly forbidden, but this is Renaissance Italy, and forbidden fruit is often sweetest. What transpired has come down to us through both rumor and the records of Pope Alexander's own master of ceremonies, Johann Burchard. The murmurs say that Cardinal Borgia effectively bought the papacy vote by vote. How? With hard coin and harder promises. To one cardinal, he allegedly promised a lucrative abbey and its rich revenues. To another, perhaps an appointment as papal treasurer. But his masterstroke was directed at Cardinal Ascanio Sforza, one of the most influential electors. Rodrigo Borgia supposedly offered Ascanio Sforza the position of vice-chancellor of the church, the very office Rodrigo held, along with a trove of rewards. Contemporary reports claim Sforza was enticed by nothing less than 4 mules laden with gold clattering into his palace, a gift from Borgia. In addition, Rodrigo is said to have handed over one of his own opulent palaces to Sforza. It was an offer Sforza could not refuse. Immense wealth, a prestigious office, and presumably more favors to come. And so, vote by vote, the Borgia candidate gained support. On the night of August 10, 1492, white smoke finally rose. Rodrigo Borgia was unanimously elected and chose the name Pope Alexander VI. When the result was announced, a shockwave went through Rome and beyond. The papacy had been won by simony, buying ecclesiastical office, not the first time, but never so brazenly. One historian drily noted that all but 5 of the 23 cardinals took bribes in that conclave. Word of the mule loads of gold spread like wildfire. Yet, importantly, nothing could be proven. The transactions left no written contracts, only whispers. Thus, by the letter of church law, the election stood. Alexander VI was pope, for better or worse. Upon hearing of his victory, the new pontiff was seen weeping for joy and exclaiming, "I am pope! I am pope!" The Roman crowd, ever fickle, cheered wildly when Alexander made his public appearance. They knew him as a generous man who threw coins to the poor on feast days and hosted spectacular public games. Perhaps a worldly pope would bring a bit of excitement and coin to the city's life. If Rodrigo's election tactics were scandalous, his actions immediately after becoming pope were utterly revolutionary. He wasted no time in rewarding those who helped him. Ascanio Sforza indeed became vice-chancellor, swapping roles with Alexander, and was showered with benefices. But Alexander VI had a bigger agenda than just paying off favors. He intended to use the unlimited powers of the papacy in a way no pope had before, as the engine of a family dynasty. In his inaugural months, Alexander VI revealed the blueprint of Papa Borgia Incorporated. His top priority was installing his children in positions of influence. He publicly acknowledged his favorite son Cesare, not merely as a bastard to be hidden, but as a legitimate power player. Imagine the gasp in clerical circles when Alexander, the vicar of Christ, petitioned to have Cesare, still officially a teenager and a cardinal, ordained as Archbishop of Valencia, one of the richest dioceses in Spain. Next, the Pope arranged marriages for his other children into Europe's grand families. Lucrezia Borgia was wed to a noble from the powerful Sforza clan of Milan, Giovanni Sforza, to cement an alliance, while Jaffer Borgia married a princess of Naples, Sancha of Aragon. His eldest son Juan, also called Giovanni, was given dukedoms and married into Spanish royalty. In a flurry of bulls and ceremonies, Alexander VI transformed his brood from papal bibelots into bona fide royals and magnates across Italy and Spain. Europe's established dynasties looked on in astonishment and, often, fury. And then there was Julia Farnese, a young Roman noblewoman known as Julia la Bella. She was Alexander's new mistress, just 17 to his 61, renowned for her beauty. The Pope scandalously installed Julia in the Vatican itself, in an apartment adjacent to his own. Tongues wagged that one wing of St. Peter's was now effectively a Borgia harem. The Banquet of Chestnuts, Tale, an alleged orgy hosted by Cesare Borgia involving courtesans crawling for chestnuts while clergy watched, belongs to this era of whispered infamy. Whether exaggerated or true, the account comes from Burchard's diary, describing a wild party in 1501. Such stories cemented the Borgias' reputation for depravity. Alexander VI did little to dispel these rumors. If anything, he flaunted his flouting of norms. He may have reasoned that a display of untouchable vice would amplify his aura of power, showing that he was above the rules ordinary men followed. And in Renaissance Italy, many observers indeed equated flagrant behavior with supreme confidence. A pope who could parade his sins openly must have formidable backing, so the logic went. Otherwise, he'd never dare. Paradoxically, Alexander's shamelessness made some courtiers respect him more. At least he wasn't a hypocrite. He was openly Renaissance, reveling in the temporal power of the papacy rather than pretending to be a saint. International reaction to Alexander VI's elevation ranged from bemused to outraged. Across the Alps, the reform-minded monk Savonarola thundered from his pulpit in Florence that the church had elected an antichrist. In whispered circles, it was noted that Martin Luther was a young monk in Germany at this time, and it's often said that Alexander VI's reign was one of the sparks that would ignite Luther's Reformation a few years later. Indeed, Alexander's brazen abuse of spiritual authority for worldly ends gave ample fodder to critics of church corruption. Yet, ironically, Pope Alexander VI was also a highly effective secular leader. He had big plans to reassert and expand the Papal States, the Pope's own territories in Italy, which had grown fractured and weak. Alexander set about reforming the chaotic papal finances, partly to better fund his ventures, of course, and strengthening Rome's fortresses. When a dangerous French invasion of Italy loomed in 1494 under King Charles VIII, Alexander VI proved a skilled diplomat and survivor. The French king actually marched into Italy, even briefly occupying Rome, aiming to claim the Kingdom of Naples. It was a moment of crisis that could have toppled an inexperienced pope. But Alexander played his cards shrewdly. He stalled Charles VIII with negotiations, even sending Cesare Borgia as a hostage, under honorable terms, to satisfy the French. When Charles overreached and political tides turned, Alexander helped engineer a pan-Italian alliance, the Holy League of 1495, that forced the French to retreat. By 1496, the French invaders were driven out, and the Pope emerged as a key broker of Italian stability. Far from being a disaster as Pope, Alexander VI was showing qualities of a formidable Renaissance statesman, just one whose moral compass pointed firmly toward family aggrandizement. As the 15th century gave way to the 16th, Alexander VI's power was at a peak. But he was not building all this for himself alone. The Borgias were constructing something unprecedented, a hereditary papal dynasty, a secular principality under the Pope's family name. The captain of that vision would not be Alexander. He wore the tiara, but he was in his 60s. The future belonged to his brilliant and brutal son, Cesare Borgia. and Cesare was about to burst onto the stage in a way that would make his father's exploits look tame. Up next, Cesare Borgia sheds his cardinal's robes to become a warlord duke. In one bold move, he resigns his red hat, something no one had ever dared, and sets out with mercenary armies to conquer Italy. His military campaigns will be so swift and stunning that even Niccolò Machiavelli, watching from Florence, will be in awe. But as Cesare's power grows, so do the dangers lurking around him. It is often said that Cesare Borgia was the inspiration for Machiavelli's The Prince, and it's not hard to see why. Cesare combined the cold calculation of a general with the polish of a courtier. But in 1492, he was just 17, a youth forced by his father's plans to become something he was never meant to be, a cardinal of the church. Yes, right after Alexander VI's ascension, he pressed Cesare into the College of Cardinals, scandalous nepotism, but why stop now? By age 18, Cesare wore the scarlet robe and hat, outwardly a prince of the church, inwardly a restless soul chafing at the bit. While Cesare performed his duties as a cardinal, somewhat perfunctorily, his older brother enjoyed the spotlight as captain general of the papal armies and Duke of Gandia. One was their father's favorite for carrying on the Borgia secular legacy. Cesare, the second son, was relegated to the church career. But fate has strange twists. In 1497, tragedy struck. One Borgia's body was found floating in the Tiber River, brutally stabbed. The culprit was never officially identified. Rumors flew that Cesare had secretly arranged his own brother's murder, an act of fratricide to eliminate a rival. Modern historians are skeptical. There were plenty of one's enemies who might have done it. Yet the rumor persisted, and in the ruthless logic of the Renaissance, it gave Cesare a dark mystique, a man supposedly willing to cut down even his kin for power. True or not, Juan's assassination changed everything. Pope Alexander was devastated by the loss of his favorite son, but the ever-pragmatic pontiff soon shifted his hopes to Cesare. Here was the silver lining. Cesare was clearly the more capable offspring, sharp, fearless, already showing a talent for strategy. Why leave him in a post he despised? Alexander VI made a momentous decision. Cesare would renounce his position as cardinal and become the instrument of Borgia's secular ambition. In 1498, Cesare Borgia became the first man in history to resign the cardinalate. This was shockingly unprecedented, a prince of the church throwing aside his sacred office and vows like an old cloak. To make it happen, Alexander VI secured a dispensation from the new French allied pope, conveniently himself. In exchange, as part of complex negotiations, King Louis XII of France got something he dearly wanted: the Pope's approval to annul Louis's marriage so he could wed, and of Brittany. The quid pro quo was clear. Alexander got French support for Cesare's plans, and Louis XII got to remake his marital and political life with Rome's blessing. France didn't just offer moral support. Louis XII showered Cesare with honors. He granted him the title Duke of Valentinois, a French dukedom, which is why Cesare is sometimes called Duke of Valentino, and married him into French nobility by giving Charlotte d'Albret, a Navarrese princess and Louis's own cousin, as Cesare's wife. Overnight, the ex-cardinal became a French duke and royal son-in-law, with King Louis as an eager ally. It was a brilliant diplomatic leap. The Borgias hitched their fortunes to France's rising star, in return for military muscle. Now, armed with a French title, a French bride, and a cache of French gold, Cesare Borgia was free to pursue his real calling: war. His goal was audacious: carve out a Borgia principality in Italy, centered on the fertile lands of Romagna and central Italy. These lands were technically part of the Papal States, but over years of weak papal rule, they'd fallen under control of local lordlings and mercenary captains. The Pope, Alexander, would give Cesare the nominal authority, appointing him captain general of the church and papal vicar in those regions, and Cesare would take them by force. They painted it as restoring order and papal authority, but in truth it was conquest for Cesare's own glory. In 1499, the campaign began. Backed by a contingent of crack French troops, France had just successfully invaded the Duchy of Milan, so their army was nearby and battle-tested. Cesare marched into Romagna like a hot knife through butter. One by one, the petty tyrants fell. His first targets, the cities of Imola and Forli, ruled by the ruthless Caterina Sforza, the widowed countess whose family, the Rierios, had defied the Borgias. Cesare besieged Forli in late 1499. Caterina Sforza famously taunted him from the ramparts, but he broke through and captured her by January 1500. She was hauled off as a trophy in chains. Her resistance had only made Cesare's triumph sweeter. Next fell Pesaro and Rimini, ruled by minor lords, one of whom was Lucrezia's discarded husband, Giovanni Sforza of Pesaro. Revenge was served as he fled for his life. Cesare's campaign was swift and surgical. By the end of 1500, he controlled a swath of territories stretching through the Romagna region. And wherever he conquered, something intriguing happened. Governance improved. Yes, you read that right. Cesare Borgia, whose name is synonymous with cruelty, turned out to be an effective ruler. He installed capable administrators, cracked down on banditry, and reduced the power of feuding nobles. In the city of Cesena, for example, locals were astonished to see justice enforced fairly and roads cleared of robbers. Machiavelli, observing all this, noted how Cesare's severity brought order and unity where anarchy had reigned. Cesare might punish a few troublemakers harshly, but the result was peace for the many. Cesare Borgia was considered cruel. Nonetheless, that cruelty united Romagna and brought it peace and stability. Machiavelli wrote, pointing out that by taking a hard line, Cesare actually proved more merciful in the long run than Italy's waffling, lenient leaders who let chaos fester. By 1501, Cesare Borgia had earned a fearsome reputation. His personal bravado only reinforced it. He wore lavish suits of armor, personally led charges into battle, and reportedly kept a pet leopard that accompanied him, a nod to his nickname, Valentino, akin to Valentine, perhaps playing on the Latin valens, meaning strong. Italy hadn't seen a condottiere like this, one with papal backing, French allies, and a ruthless streak, in living memory. It's no wonder Machiavelli, as Florence's envoy, became a bit obsessed with Cesare. Machiavelli met with him multiple times, analyzing his moves with cold admiration. To Machiavelli, Cesare embodied the ideal new prince, unencumbered by conventional morality, focused only on the calculus of power. But Cesare was not invincible. In 1502, after 2 years of victories, the young duke faced the inevitable blowback of success. His own captains and allies began to fear and envy him. A half-dozen powerful condottieri, including Vitellozzo Vitelli and Oliverado da Fermo, men who had helped Cesare conquer Romagna, formed a secret cabal against him. They saw Cesare's star rising and worried he would eventually dispose of them as he had others. So these mercenary lords plotted to strike first, possibly even to assassinate Cesare and assert their own control over the territories. Cesare Borgia, however, had built an extensive spy network. He caught wind that something was afoot. Pretending to be ignorant, he invited the ringleaders to parley and reconcile. Suspicious, they initially refused. The situation was extremely tense. If Cesare lost control of these henchmen, his hard-won lands could slip away or erupt in rebellion. But here, the Borgia cunning went into overdrive. Cesare pulled off one of the most legendary tricks in military history, the conspiracy of Senegalia. On December 31st, 1502, Cesare met the condottieri leaders in the town of Senegalia, ostensibly to forgive past misunderstandings and welcome them back into his grace. The conspirators arrived warily, but Cesare played the host to perfection, affable, embracing them like brothers, even inviting them to join him for a grand New Year's Eve banquet. Little did they know, Cesare had quietly prepositioned his loyal troops around the town. At a signal, his men seized Vitelli, Oliverado, and the Orsini cousins. The traitors walked right into a trap. That night, After a swift kangaroo court, Cesare had the two main ringleaders strangled and later executed others involved in the plot. Machiavelli, who was nearby and got reports of the event, was awed. He wrote an account titled Description of the Methods Adopted by the Duke Valentino in Murdering Vitellozzo Vitelli, Oliverado de Fermo, practically admiring the elegance of Cesare's deceit. The Senegalia maneuver sent an unmistakable message: betray Cesare Borgia, and you won't live to regret it. The start of 1503 found Cesare Borgia at zenith. He was now Duke of Romagna, de facto lord of central Italy from the Apennines to the Adriatic. Cities that had for generations been under petty tyrants were now loyal, or at least submissive, to him and, by extension, to Pope Alexander. Cesare's brutality had midwifed a kind of stability. In the words of Machiavelli, on careful reflection, he was more merciful than the Florentines who, to avoid being seen as cruel, allowed disorder to destroy their city. Cesare had demonstrated the very thesis Machiavelli would later make famous. It's better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both. And Cesare was undoubtedly feared, but also respected, even admired by some, for his efficiency and vision. Yet, even as Cesare Borgia reached for more, rumored targets included the mighty city of Florence itself, or maybe a crown in Naples. An invisible clock was ticking. All his success relied on one indispensable foundation: his father, Pope Alexander VI. Cesare knew it. Machiavelli knew it. Every Italian prince knew it. As long as Alexander VI was pope, Cesare had unlimited papal resources at his command: troops, money, legitimacy for his conquests. If Alexander were to die, Cesare's enemies would pounce and the French alliance might evaporate overnight. And Pope Alexander VI was in his 70s. In the summer of 1503, Cesare and his father were in Rome, planning yet more campaigns. Italy watched with a mix of dread and fascination. Would the Borgias transform the Papal States into a hereditary Borgia kingdom? It seemed within reach. But then fate intervened in the most dramatic way, taking us back to where we began our story. That stifling August when both father and son were struck down by fever on the same day. We return now to that critical moment. The Pope is dying, Cesare is incapacitated, and vultures are circling. The fall of the Borgias comes swiftly, but its outcome is far from simple. Betrayals, plots, and desperate escapes mark Cesare's final chapter, and the legacy of Machiavelli's prince emerges from the ruins. Stay with us. The climax is at hand. August 1503, the Borgia dream teetered on the brink. Pope Alexander VI, vigorous into his 70s, suddenly fell ill after a dinner at a cardinal's villa. Cesare Borgia, in the prime of his life, was stricken by likely the same affliction. The speed was alarming. One day they were plotting conquests. The next, they were delirious with high fevers, incapacitated. In the rumor-fueled culture of Rome, many concluded it had to be poison. How poetic would it be if the poisoners-in-chief accidentally took their own poison? Some whispered that the dinner's host, Cardinal Adriano de Corneto, had poisoned them, perhaps preemptively striking before Cesare could seize his property. Others suggested the Borgias themselves had intended to poison the cardinal and tragically mixed up the wine chalice. Modern historians, however, lean toward a less cinematic explanation: malaria, or another virulent fever common in Rome's marshy summer climate. The symptoms, raging fever, gastrointestinal torment, fit malaria or an infectious disease as much as any toxin. Regardless of cause, the effect was undeniable. Alexander VI was dying, and Cesare could barely stand. On August 18, 1503, Pope Alexander VI succumbed. Upon his death, Rome erupted, not in mourning, but in chaos and revenge. The Pope's enemies, which were legion, took off their masks. Mobs ran through the streets crying out against Borgia tyranny. The powerful Roman families, the Colonna and Orsini, sent armed gangs to reclaim control of city strongholds that Alexander had taken from them. In a grim postscript, Alexander's body, bloated and blackened, whether from illness or the summer heat, was reportedly mocked by onlookers as it lay in state. Burchard records that the corpse swelled so fast it barely fit in the coffin and had to be trampled down to close the lid. It was as if, even in death, Alexander VI scandalized the city. Cesare Borgia, upon his father's death, faced the greatest crisis of his life. Bedridden and weak, he was in no condition to command troops or sway politics. Yet events moved at blinding speed. The papal conclave to elect a successor convened within weeks. Cesare's entire future hinged on who wore the tiara next. He desperately needed a friendly pope who would uphold his titles and perhaps be content to let Cesare keep ruling his hard-won Romagna. If an enemy of the Borgias gained the throne, Cesare was finished. Ailing or not, Cesare sprang into action as best he could. He still had at his disposal an army in the field and considerable wealth, though much locked up in the Vatican, now inaccessible. He made a gamble. He threw the support of his faction behind an old cardinal, Francesco Piccolomini, who became Pope Pius III in September 1503. Pius III was neutral enough and weak enough for Cesare's purposes, a placeholder who wouldn't threaten Cesare's holdings. Indeed, Pius III kept Cesare on as captain general of the church. But this pope was gravely ill and died after a mere 26 days on the throne. The wheel of fortune spun again, and this time Cesare's worst nightmare came true. In October 1503, the conclave elected Giuliano della Rovere as Pope Julius II. This was the same cardinal who had been Alexander VI's bitter enemy and who had never ceased plotting against the Borgias. Julius II, known as the warrior pope, would ironically go on to be a great patron of the arts, Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling, and a restorer of papal military might. But his first order of business was destroying Cesare Borgia. Julius II harbored a personal vendetta. He had been the one forced into French exile while Alexander reigned, and rumor said Julius's family, the Della Rovere, had suffered under Borgia schemes. As soon as Julius II was crowned, the reprisals began. He ordered Cesare Borgia arrested on dubious charges, and although Cesare initially found sanctuary in Naples under Spanish protection, it was a trap. The new pope convinced Gonzalo de Córdoba, the Spanish viceroy in Naples, to betray Cesare. In 1504, Cesare was shipped off to Spain as a prisoner, a gift to King Ferdinand, who was Julius's ally. The great conqueror of Romagna now languished in a damp Spanish fortress. It seemed like the end. The Borgia Empire collapsed in months. The lords and cities Cesare had subjugated swiftly threw off Borgia governors once news spread that the Pope had turned on him. Julius II formally reabsorbed Cesare's duchy into the Papal States. He even had the Borgia apartments in the Vatican sealed up, as if trying to erase the very memory of the family. Lucrezia Borgia, safely away in Ferrara, went into mourning for her father but wisely distanced herself from her brother's ruin. She would not lift a finger to help Cesare now, nor could she, realistically. The Borgia name in Italy became radioactive overnight. Borgia was a curse word again, no longer a power to fear. It was astonishing how thoroughly the papal aristocracy tried to airbrush the Borgias out. If Alexander's reign had been a bad dream, Julius was here to ensure everyone woke up and moved on. But Cesare Borgia was not one to accept a cage quietly. In 1506, 2 years into his Spanish captivity, he executed a daring escape from a castle in Castile. Lowering himself by a rope from his window, bribing guards, the details read like an adventure novel. He fled to his brother-in-law's territory, Navarre, the mountain kingdom between Spain and France. His wife, Charlotte d'Albret, remained in France with their infant daughter, but Charlotte's brother was King John III of Navarre. King John welcomed the fallen duke, perhaps seeing a use for this warrior as a captain in Navarre's own conflicts. Sure enough, Navarre was embroiled in a fight with rebellious nobles, and who better to lead John's forces than Cesare Borgia, Duke of nothing but master of war? By 1507, Cesare seemed to have a second chance. He donned armor once more, commanding Navarrese troops to suppress a revolt at the fortified town of Viano. Through winter sieges and skirmishes in Navarre's rugged hills, Cesare showed flashes of his old brilliance. But destiny would not be postponed. On March 12, 1507, during a minor engagement outside Viano, Cesare pursued a band of retreating rebels with a handful of men, some say out of overeagerness or a desire to prove his mettle. He became separated from his main force. In the melee that followed, Cesare Borgia was killed, stripped of his fine armor, and left almost naked on the field. He was just 31 years old. The man who had once made all Italy tremble died in obscurity far from the lands he had fought to rule. When news of Cesare's death reached Italy, Machiavelli, now back in Florence, took note. "I will never fear to cite Cesare Borgia and his actions," Machiavelli later wrote, reflecting that fortune had ultimately defeated Cesare, but not exposed any flaw in his methods. In Machiavelli's eyes, Cesare did everything right, except control the one thing he couldn't, the timing of his father's death. Indeed, Machiavelli's The Prince dedicates a whole chapter, chapter 7, to analyzing Cesare's rise and fall, praising his cleverness and lamenting his stroke of bad luck. The lessons? That a new ruler must secure power quickly and ruthlessly, but also that relying on someone else's fortune, like a pope's favor, is a great vulnerability. Machiavelli's famous dictum that it's safer to be feared than loved finds real-life backing in Cesare's pacification of Romagna. And his warning that a prince must avoid being hated is mirrored in how public outrage at Borgia corruption helped undo Cesare when opportunity arose. So ended the house of Borgia's direct male line of power. What of Lucrezia, the Pope's daughter? Her story took a very different trajectory, one that continued beyond the fall of the men. After Alexander VI's death, Lucrezia's third husband, Duke Alfonso d'Este, kept her at arm's length initially, wary that the Borgia stigma might taint Ferrara. But over time, Lucrezia proved herself an adept duchess. She reinvented her image. The wild rumors of her youth, that she had incestuous relations with her father and brother, claims first spread by her spurned first husband Giovanni Sforza in 1497, gradually faded, at least in educated circles, recognized as character assassination with no evidence. In Ferrara, Lucrezia became a patron of poets and artists, a respected signora. She skillfully managed affairs of state when Alfonso was away at war. By the time she died in 1519 due to complications from childbirth, Lucrezia was mourned in Ferrara as an honorable princess. The rumors of poison rings and femme fatale machinations never entirely left her legend, but modern historians largely view her more sympathetically, as a pawn who adapted to survive and even thrive in a toxic political environment. In a twist of fate, another Borgia even achieved a kind of sainthood. Saint Francis Borgia, a great-grandson of Rodrigo, became a devout Jesuit in the 16th century and was canonized in 1671. The Borgia bloodline continued in Spain and Italy in diminished form, petering out by the 18th century. But as a power dynasty, the Borgias were finished after 1507. Julius II and later popes divided the spoils, and the Borgia lands melted back into the Papal States or were snapped up by rivals. The Borgia's story is a rise and fall parable of Renaissance excess, but it is far more than a lurid historical anecdote. Their legacy profoundly shaped how we understand power, politics, and even religion. In the immediate aftermath, the Borgias became the poster family for corrupt governance. The cry for reform that would soon birth the Protestant Reformation in 1517 found one of its strongest justifications in the Borgia papacy of Alexander VI. Martin Luther, upon hearing of the debauchery in Rome, some details exaggerated, no doubt, felt confirmed in his conviction that the church needed purging. In that sense, the Borgias inadvertently helped usher in a religious revolution that ended the medieval world and began the modern age of Protestant-Catholic divide. Yet, on the flip side, the Borgias also left a template for centralized power that later popes and secular rulers alike would follow. Julius II, Alexander's successor, ironically pursued a similarly aggressive policy of consolidating the papal states, only without the overt nepotism. He drove out foreign armies and cemented the papacy as a major Italian power, fulfilling some of Cesare's vision, albeit under a different family's banner. In secular politics, the era of nation-states was dawning, and the tactics the Borgias used, alliances through marriage, the creation of loyal bureaucratic networks, the emphasis on standing military force and statecraft unencumbered by moral constraints. All these became staples of the new age. It's telling that Machiavelli's The Prince, published in 1532, heavily references Cesare Borgia's methods. European monarchs read Machiavelli, and through him, they learned from Cesare's mix of cunning and audacity. One could say the Borgias helped kill the medieval idea of a purely spiritual papacy and replaced it with the concept of realpolitik, politics based on practical objectives and power dynamics, not on morality or tradition. Every time a leader today puts family members in high office, we hear the term nepotism, a term popularized precisely because of papal nephews like the Borgia kin. Every time a government official is accused of graft or simony, we're echoing scandals that the Borgias exemplified. And yet, the Borgias also showed that efficient governance can earn a measure of public support even from an initially hostile populace. Cesare's rule in Romagna, brutal but orderly, made Machiavelli and others ponder the trade-offs between security and liberty. This debate is very much alive today. How much authoritarian control are people willing to accept for the promise of stability? The Borgia story forces us to confront this uncomfortable question in its most extreme form. In cultural memory, the Borgias became symbols of decadence and treachery. Renaissance poets and, later, novelists like Alexander Dumas spun tales of Lucrezia's poisoned rings and Cesare's dark love for his sister. These are exaggerations. The truth was bad enough without needing fiction, but it shows that the world could not forget the Borgias. They had an aura of dark glamour that has kept them in the public imagination through the centuries, from plays and operas to the modern TV dramas. They are the family everyone loves to hate, cast almost as supervillains of the Renaissance. Yet beneath that cartoonish image lies their real historical significance. They were innovators in power consolidation. They turned the tools of their era, bribery, marriage, warfare, even religion, into means of state building. In doing so, they shattered taboos. A pope who openly acknowledges his children? Unthinkable, until Alexander did it. A pope who leads armies into battle? Julius too would do that, learning from Alexander's militarization of the papacy. A cardinal who abandons the church to become a secular prince? Cesare blazed that trail. They broke the mold in so many ways that even their enemies ended up adopting parts of the Borgia playbook, minus the most scandalous bits, perhaps. Look around today's world. Whenever a political leader behaves as if normal rules don't apply to them, deploying shock tactics to stun opponents, you're seeing a sliver of the Borgia spirit. When a government official is entangled in nepotism, boosting family members into key posts, they're walking a path the Borgias trod very confidently. When a regime uses both fear and populist spectacle, think of Alexander's grand jubilee of 1,500 where pilgrims were drawn in and fleeced for indulgences. It echoes how the Borgias wielded power over the masses. They understood optics. Alexander VI literally had a holy year carnival to awe Christendom while filling his coffers. Modern spin doctors do the same under different guises. In the end, the Borgias as individuals died or faded, but the lessons of their rise and fall became immortal through Machiavelli and the cautionary tales historians recounted. Their story asks us, how far will we go for power? And what are we willing to overlook in those who attain it? The Borgias revealed that charisma and ruthlessness in tandem can bend the world, but also that fortunes can turn overnight when you overreach. So, as you consider current events, keep an eye out for those Borgian fingerprints. Do you see a leader placing personal ambition above all ethical or legal considerations? Do you see power being kept in a family circle or inner clique at the expense of institutions? Are grand promises or theatrics being used to distract from secret dealings? These patterns didn't die in 1507. They simply evolved with the times. The game of power never ends. It only changes players and strategies. And thanks to the Borgias, we have a manual, albeit a morally troubling one, on how that game can be played to the extreme. Before we close, let's reflect. The Borgias took the Catholic Church, an institution meant to save souls, and used it to build a worldly empire. In doing so, they forced the Church to eventually reform and redeem itself, the Counter-Reformation. They also forced secular rulers to up their game, to be smarter and more strategic, to prevent such a coup in the future. In a way, the Borgias were the stress test for the old system. It cracked under them, and new systems of governance emerged in response. As a final thought, consider this. The Borgia saga might have ended over 500 years ago, but the dynamics at its heart are timeless. Ambition, manipulation, loyalty, betrayal. Every organization and government grapples with these. That's why we remain fascinated, and why it's crucial to learn from such history. If you thought the Borgias' 11-year reign was dramatic, wait until you hear about the Romanovs, who ruled the Russian Empire for over 300 years. We're talking about a dynasty that navigated endless palace intrigues, violent uprisings, and sweeping social changes, yet endured from the 17th century all the way to the dawn of the 20th. Catherine the Great's coup to seize the throne, the eccentric mystic Rasputin gaining influence over the last Tsar's family, and finally the harrowing end in a basement at Ekaterinburg in 1918. The Romanov story has everything on an even grander scale. How did they manage to cling to absolute power for so long? And what led to their catastrophic downfall? The patterns might surprise you. And yes, you'll even spot some echoes of Borgia-like strategy and tragedy. So, make sure you're subscribed and have the notification bell turned on. Our journey through history's most powerful families is just getting started, and the lessons only get deeper. The game of power, as we've seen, never truly ends. It just finds new arenas. If this deep dive into the Borgias changed how you think about power and history, hit that like button. And let us know in the comments, which modern figure or regime do you think comes closest to the Borgias in their tactics or notoriety? It's a provocative question, but remember, understanding the past gives us sharp insight into the present. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for the saga of the Romanovs next week. History's dynasties have a lot more to teach us, and you won't want to miss a single twist. Until next time, stay curious and keep unraveling the real Game of Thrones that is our world's history.